now recording.
10 years ago, I was, September of 2006, I was invited to a meeting of the Scientific and Medical Network in Rawtenstall in Lancashire. This was, the Scientific and Medical Network are a group of academics and scientists and medical people, hence the name. They're pretty good at actually mirror imaging what they do. And they have groups all around the country and in fact around the world. And this was my local group. And the reason I went up there was that a writer friend of mine called Evelyn Alassa Valorano was speaking. I hadn't actually met Evelyn, but I had been in contact with her by writing. She's an expert on near-death experiences and such like. And I drove over to Rawtenstall. And in fact, it was quite a fraught day because my wife and I were due to go on holiday the next day, so we had to leave early from the event. And when we arrived there, there was the normal group of people, and in the group was this incredibly smartly dressed guy who looked like he could be a consultant surgeon or something, and he really stood out. And I got chatting to him and discovered that he had had the most amazing near-death experience. And in fact, that's why he was there, because he knew Evelyn from his own research. And from then onwards, Bill Murtha, who was the gentleman, has now become very good friends. And we've been in contact now over the last 10 years. Now, the reason I was very keen to have Bill as a guest on the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour is that I consider Bill's near-death experience to be the most amazing experience I have ever come across. I've written about it on many occasions in my books, but if you have never come across this experience before, this will blow your mind. Bill has written a book on it called Dying for a Change, which is well worth checking out. But it's Bill's story beforehand, it's his story afterwards that is totally fascinating. And the one thing I will ask Bill is we have to leave until the end how you eventually were saved, because that's the bit that always is the gasper at the end. That is the one that really pulls it all together in the most uncanny way. So first of all, Bill, welcome to the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour.
Lovely, thank you very much. Nice to be here.
And you're still down in Devon, are you? So you're in your little home?
Yeah, I'm still down in Totnes with me and Jane and enjoying the sunshine. So yeah, we're here, right in the heart of Devon.
Right, because it was in the Devon coast back in, as I recall, 1999, that the events took place that were to change your life. So can you tell us a little bit about your background first? So can you lead up to how you were riding along the sea wall on that particular day? I think it was April 1999, I think, if I can recall correctly. But can you do a little background about yourself, and then we can build up to the events that took place that fateful day?
I mean, very quickly, because I know you just want a brief background, but, you know, I've got two brothers and we'd grown up in East London, and we'd had a very hard childhood. My father was an alcoholic, and so the three of us were very driven. None of us went to university, but because we had a background of sort of, you know, a really hard background, a tenacious sort of background of growing up in childhood, we both, well, all three of us done very well in business. So I'd gradually, you know, from a personal point of view, I'd worked my way up through sales organisations in the construction and development industry, and up to 99, I'd got myself as a, you know, as a directorship in a very big organisation called Taylor Maxwell, and we supplied a lot of house builders and contractors, and you know, it was a million miles away from where I sort of started, you know, at the ground level. We had sort of 200 odd people, and you know, turning over quite a lot of million, in the hundreds of millions. But the pressure, you know, I've not really at that stage in 99, just before the accident, got used to the pressures of sort of managing a lot of people and a lot of money. Had big bonuses, and I think with the pressures at that stage, it was just starting to affect me in different ways. I now know in retrospect that was starting to sort of, I had a shadow effect really starting to hit my consciousness level, and doing a lot of drinking. There was a drug issue there, and there's sort of lots of things that I was running away from reality really. And typical British man, I didn't really open up to it and tell anyone about it or talk to anyone about it. You just try and bulldoze your way through very arrogantly, ignorantly, and try and pretend that you're going to get back online. But of course, things don't happen like that. And what I used to do, I used to sort of, I was away a lot, had a very high pressure job, so I was away a lot. But when I was at home, I used to like to ride down on the coast for a sort of 5-mile bike ride, because it was a good way of sort of really pumping, almost sort of hurting yourself to sort of just burn that sort of that pressure out of your body. And on that one particular night, I was riding along the sea coast wall, just close to my home in Dawlish, which is near Torquay.
Yeah, just to explain to any listeners who are in the United States who may not know the geography of the UK, Devon is in the extreme west country, and it's in that peninsula that actually points out into the Atlantic Sea. Particularly beautiful part of the country. Very, very nice in so many ways. And there is this amazing seawall that runs down from Dawlish or into Dawlish along the estuary, which is this huge river estuary that runs out into the English Channel. And as you'll particularly imagine that in the UK at that time of the year, which is this time of year now really, although the weather can be quite reasonable, it can be extremely cold in the water. But what happened to Will is strange in the extreme. So without further ado, this is what happened to Will.
I mean, just to sort of give it a background as well, I mean, we're only sort of about half an hour from Plymouth, which is obviously where the Mayflower went off to America. So, we're on that western sort of tip of the UK. But coming back to the story, I mean, when I left home, the funny thing is, I had a gut feeling that things were very different that particular evening. I didn't know why. I just had that underlying feeling in my stomach as I left my home, and grabbed my bike to go off to the on the seawall. But just things were a little bit unusual that night. The clouds seemed a bit sort of, it was going to be a full moon that evening. But I'd gone through a funny time that particular day, because it was one of those occasions where I'd listened to a radio show that particular day, and I'd pulled over, and I'd usually been rushing at 100 mile an hour in my job. I was out on the road, and I was trying to sort of get from one appointment to another, one pressured sort of meeting to the next, and for whatever reason, I happened to turn the radio on that day, and someone was just talking on the radio about how most of us have sort of got out of alignment, and we've sort of been so driven with business and bonuses and materialism and big houses and big cars, which was pretty much my life at the time. And something had resonated, like these things happen, something had resonated inside me, and I'd actually pulled over for 20 minutes or so and listened to this radio show, and this guy was just sort of talking. And this, something dinged inside of me, because this guy had on the outside everything, and yet inwardly he was poor. And it really resonated with me. And coming back to the sort of the evening, when I'm bombing along on the sea wall, or this wall that is about 20 foot above the sea, this conversation just hung around in my mind, like these things do when something sort of profound is happening inside of us. And this conversation just kept niggling away at me, sort of, almost battling. There was two selves inside me. One that was saying, well, you're doing very well, and you've got your big cars and your bonuses and your big holidays to Disney and all the rest of it. Your kids wanted for nothing. My wife had a new car every year. But there was just this other niggling sort of that there wasn't much meaning and purpose there. And I'm sort of pedaling along really fast. It's sort of at 8 o'clock at night, the sun's going down, not many people about. It's this time of year, April, and the wind's starting to pick up. And I just noticed that the sea was starting to dramatically shift. It had gone from being very still, and it was starting to chop up, which normally happens on a sort of full moon. And I'm riding along on my push bike, there's no one about, and suddenly this freak wave from nowhere came sort of above the 20-foot wall, absolutely sort of drenched me, pushed me off my bike, and I knocked against against the wall. There was a railway track there with a small sort of 3-foot high wall, and the wave sort of bashed me against the wall, and the water didn't have anywhere to go, so it rushed sort of down back over the sort of the algae covered wall downwards. But unfortunately I'd lost my sort of balance, and I'd caught it as well, and before I knew it, I'm tumbling backwards towards the rocks below, and it's all things are going through my mind, thinking I'm going to smash my head on the rocks. Luckily, I sort of landed between a couple of rocks in the freezing cold water, sort of hit the water with a burst. All I can remember is sort of being a bit dazed, but coming back up for air and absolutely elated. I sort of punched the air, thinking I've survived, you know, I've been lucky and fortunate there. And then it starts to dawn on me, you know, every sort of 5-10 seconds, the waves are bashing me up against this algae-covered wall that's in the shade. And I start to realise that, you know, I'm in trouble now, and what am I going to do? And luckily, I was quite fit at that time. I was a semi-professional football player. I was probably as fit as I'd ever been at that, you know, in my life. And I sort of needed every bit of sort of energy to sort of think, you know, quickly and, you know, keep my head above the water, because I was starting to swallow a lot of seawater. And it started to rapidly, you know, I started to get to this point of realising I'm going to have to get away from the wall and use every bit of energy I can to sort of push my way away, because otherwise I'm really in trouble here. And so I sort of managed over a sort of period of sort of a couple of minutes to sort of use every bit of energy I could to just get beyond the breakers and sort of get sort of, you know, 100 feet out and away. And then it just started to all settle down. And at that point, you know, the waves weren't sort of, you know, I was only sort of riding the waves as opposed to being sort of slammed by them. And then it sort of just started to dawn on me that, you know, how on earth am I going to get out of here? The sun's starting to disappear over the sea. And what was probably even worse, which I can remember at the time, just thinking the irony of it, the sea wall was sort of right on the edge of the town. Nobody would probably be walking out with their dogs as it gets dark, you know, people felt a bit afraid that time of night. And the worst thing was, I looked up towards the church in the town centre, and this is a small town, probably about 10,000 people in Dawlish. And the ironic thing was, there was a row of houses right next to the church, and I could actually see my house. We had a big sort of 3-story house. It was the home that I'd always dreamed of, a Georgian sort of home, white-faced, you know, 3-story, and I could actually see the light in my children's bedroom from a distance, bearing in mind this is probably about half a mile away, but I could still see their light and think, you know, they're going to bed. And, you know, my wife's probably up there reading the story, and you know, nobody knows that I'm fighting for my life here, and I can just remember that sort of horrible sensation and feeling of thinking, nobody knows I'm here, nobody can come and find me, nobody can come and try and help me. And it just, over the period of like an hour, I just start to really, you know, and I'm struggling to sort of, you know, paddle water to keep sort of afloat. And then it just, all these things start to go through your mind that, you know, I don't really think I'm going to get out of here, and I didn't have the energy to sort of swim towards the shore, and if I did, there's no point, because, you know, I'm going to get slammed up against the wall again. And it's at that point that the hypothermia started to really kick in, and then you start to just get to this real realization that this is it. This is really it. And, you know, I could start, you know, there was pains in my body. Imagine all the organs in my body. They were all starting to, obviously after an hour, you know, it's freezing cold. They're starting to shut down. And I knew I was getting an aching, you know, kidneys at the back, and my heart was sort of throbbing, and I was getting a sore throat with the seawater that, you know, I was doing quite well, making sure I could gauge when the next wave would hit every sort of 10 seconds or so. But even then I'd get caught out, and suddenly, you know, I'd start to shake. And it's at that point that you start to realise that you know, this is how you're going to die. And it's an awful feeling because, you know, my daughters were sort of, I think, about 6 and 8 at the time. And I just started to realise that, you know, I'm not going to see him again. I'm not going to see my wife again. All sorts of weird things go through your mind. Like, you know, I'm thinking, well, she's got life insurance, she's going to be okay. But it sort of broke my heart that, you know, all the things that we want to tell the people that mean most to us in our lives. The best way, someone's often asked me, what does it actually feel like knowing that you're going to die quickly or within an hour or so? And I said the best way that probably describes it is, imagine someone coming along and taking you in a little white room and sort of, you know, shutting the door and then saying, right, okay, Bill, you've got an hour to live. Sorry, you can't say goodbye to all the people that you love, and pretty much in the next hour it's going to be up. And there was this realisation, I'm not going to see my daughters get married, I'm not going to see them possibly have children, I'm not going to say goodbye to my friends. And the worst thing than that, I thought, well, somebody somewhere is going to probably find my body in a real hell of a state in the next couple of days or weeks, or perhaps not at all. But, you know, people obviously knew I was under stress and had a, you know, really high-powered job, and I thought, are people going to think that I've committed suicide because I'm not going to be there to tell the story? And I think that was, you know, as well as missing my wife and my children, the fact of thinking that everyone thought I must have topped myself was just as depressing and sad as as anything else. So after sort of this realization and this real anger, you know, then you get this wave of anger that comes in of, you know, often when people come to the end of their life, it's not all the silly and stupid things that they've, that they've regretted. It's often all the things they didn't do, and there was so much that I promised myself that I was going to do in my life, and that's what I really felt sad about, is all the, you know, all the stupid things that I put off till the next day, or, you know, I said I'm going to do next year. I just felt a sort of a sense of, you know, I mean, I always remember Wayne Dyer sort of talking about, you know, the biggest fear people have when they're ready, you know, at the end of their life is that nobody wants to die with the music still in them. And I can just remember that sort of constantly going through my mind. You know, I felt that I was dying with still a lot of the music. You know, I'd always wanted to write, I'd always wanted to do this and you know, various things that were going through my mind. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to, you know, to potentially do any of them. And that was really sad. So when I'd got past this sort of anger stage, there was a sort of stillness that started to come in. And you know, that was at that stage that I really started to sort of come in and out of consciousness. And that's when all this, you know, the unusual visions and, I mean, do you want me to carry on, Anthony, or did you?
Yeah, fine. I'll just put in here and then we will continue with this. I think every time you tell me this story and this experience, it really moves me, because you actually describe what it is like to realize you're going to die. And people never ever think about that, I don't think. They think about the circumstances by which you'll die and whether it's going to be painful, whether it's going to be traumatic and everything else. But you're in this horrible situation of being aware of the fact that death was imminent and that the chances of you being saved under those circumstances were highly unlikely. So you had time to think about your life. And as you said, you know, with the music still in you, what a wonderful term, because it says so much, doesn't it? Now, one of the things in my first book, Is There Life After Death, is I discuss this way in which it does seem that under certain circumstances, certain near-death experiences that are particularly powerful ones are ones whereby the person who is about to die is aware that death is inevitable. You know, it's this like mountain climbers that fall, you know, and they're falling for about 20 seconds or whatever, and they're aware of the fact that death is about to happen, or people in car crashes and these kind of things. They seem to have a very different kind of approach. A near-death experience that happens under these circumstances seems to allow the body, or something inside the body, or something inside the psyche, to prepare itself. And I think that near-death experiences under these circumstances, as Albert Heim, who was the guy that wrote a very important book about near-death experiences, and particularly something called a panoramic life review, he interviewed many people who've been involved in mountaineering accidents. And there was a high number of people who had flashbacks to their own past. and to periods in their own past. And this is exactly what took place with you. Now, the important thing to stress here to the listeners of this program and this podcast is that before this happened, this was something that Bill was not even vaguely interested in. He was in a high-powered job. His world just didn't involve these kind of things. But here is somebody who has an experience that he wasn't expecting. He hadn't read about near-death experiences. Therefore, everything that now Bill will tell us was happening to somebody who would have rejected, probably out of hand, the things that happened. And this is of profound importance. So, Bill, so you're in the water, your body's shutting down, you've got hypothermia taking place, you suddenly have what's called the oceanic feeling. Can you explain what then happened to you?
Yeah, so the sun's almost disappeared, and it's that sort of twilight, and I'm looking up to the town, and all the lights are starting to go on. I'm looking at my house, you know, knowing that my wife and children are there in bed, and, you know, I've gone past the rage, I've gone past the sort of denial, I've gone past the feeling of sort of sadness about, you know, what, you know, and it's almost like an acceptance. It's like the Kubler-Ross sort of, you've gone through the processes of death in a way, mini death, and I've got to this sort of stage of almost acceptance at the same time that I'm starting to drift in and out of consciousness. And I can just remember, the problem is, it's a bit like, the best way to describe it is a bit like that few moments and seconds when you first either wake up in the morning, or those moments when you're drifting off in the evening, where you're not quite sure if you're here or there, you know, things sort of start to blur a bit, you know, you move on them different brain waves. And I started to sort of almost come in and out of consciousness, and I knew I was starting to really get in trouble, because up until then, a lot of the pain, you know, a lot of your organs, when they start to shut down and start to sort of, you know, freeze, you know, the pain is just unbelievable. Well, what started to happen, the pain started to subside, and I actually started to get a warm feeling, and that really frightened me, because I actually started to feel quite good, and you start to realise that you're getting close to the edge. And it's a weird paradox, really. In some ways, you're sort of, you know, you're relaxing into it, and another part of you doesn't want to let go, because you pretty much know you're on them last legs then. And so I'm starting to get this lovely sort of warm feeling that I'm fighting and accepting at the same time, if that makes sense. And then, bizarrely, I just started to get this this sort of recall, first of all. I mean, there's two stages to this. You know, there's the best way I can describe it is that if anyone listening can imagine say the dozen top emotional moments of your life. Now, that could be positive or negative, you know, watching your first child come into the world, getting married perhaps, you know, these are the nice things, you know, perhaps seeing your father and mother do a 50th wedding, you know, anniversary, you know, or negative things, you know, a couple of things that you might remember from your childhood, or being really shamed and embarrassed. So you know, I won't go into them, but there was quite a few of these moments, and it's almost like, and I'll give you one example. I got knocked down as a child when I was in London as an 11-year-old, and without watching the road, I just ran across, and of course I got hit by a car, and just, you know, car was going 40 miles an hour or something, and luckily I'd stand on the side of the car. Anyway, it completely sort of poleaxed me, and I'm sort of on the floor. And for a moment, so you know, I'm in the water, but I'm reliving this moment that is very profound to me as an 11-year-old. But this time, I'm reliving it, and I can, you know, it's not like a memory, it's more than a memory, because I can actually feel the emotions inside my body. I'm there, everything around me is, you know, if I look at my body, I'm an 11-year-old, and everything is happening as if I'm right back in that moment, reliving it. Only this time, the emotions are a lot heightened. I'm starting to feel things that I wouldn't normally have perhaps felt as an 11-year-old. There's a higher level of awareness. So I'm lying on the floor, being here. I can hear the car crash into the wall that had hit me. I can hear all these voices in the background, but I'm literally out cold on the floor, listening to sort of all this screaming. I can hear this sort of woman running over to me, who I presume, you know, is the car driver, and she's screaming and she's on the floor, and I can't remember if I opened my eyes or not, but I'm aware that she's there absolutely sobbing. She thinks she's killed me, and everything's sort of happening in sort of slow motion, you know, as I'm recalling this event as an 11-year-old while I'm in the water. So there's this weird sort of thing going on where these memories are coming back. But the funny thing here is the memory just didn't stop there. The next thing that happened, again, I'm back in that moment as an 11-year-old, but bizarrely, this time I'm not Bill the child, the 11-year-old. I'm the driver of the car, and which happened to be a Rolls Royce actually. I'm driving this car, and I actually look at myself as an 11-year-old, and I look at my hands on a steering wheel, and they're painted, so, you know, I know I'm the woman. Anyway, she hits me, who I think is me, and then crash into this sort of wall. I can feel the palpitations and the fear of thinking I've killed this boy. And I realised that I'm reliving the same scenario, only from her viewpoint, to feel what she feels, and the agony and the frustration and the just actually sheer shock, you know, horrific sort of feelings that she's going through. And I feel myself sort of falling out of the car. I rush over to the body, which is obviously me on the floor. But I just get to this point of realising that I'm replaying this whole thing to experience what this poor woman must have gone through. Now, bearing in mind in 1999, when I'm in the water, I'm 34 years old, 33, 34 years old. Not until that very moment in the water had I ever given that poor woman any thought about what she must have gone through up until that point, you know, since being an 11-year-old. It just doesn't enter my consciousness. And there was lots of other moments like that, which I'm not going to go into, but there was lots of other replays, I would call them, only they seem to be, you know, from a higher level of consciousness. And these things just, you know, one minute I'm in the water and I'm looking up at the town and the lights and church and everything, and the next minute I'm back in this next replay from the past. And all of these seem to sort of play out as if I needed to see them from a different level of consciousness. And as if that wasn't, you know, the most bizarre thing, then I get right to, you know, near the end point of sort of almost accepting that pretty much. I've done quite well in my life. I'm quite proud that I've had 2 children and got married, and had a good life up until that point. I'd pretty much accepted that that's it, I'm finished. And this inner peace started to sort of wash over me, and you know, everyone must come to the end of their life. You know, I've got a few friends in palliative care, and actually, funny enough, I got one of my best friends who's going literally through the last days of her life now. Very close friend of mine, which is quite painful. But the only thing I can think of is that you must go through this final point of accepting that you're pretty much finished. And this warmth comes in, and this acceptance when you stop fighting it. And I pretty much sort of almost started to close my eyes and think, just take me, and that's it. And then this voice, this, you know, bizarre voice came in and started to sort of make a conversation with me. Now, this is going to sound a bit strange, but we all have these voices, these inner dialogue, you know, this sort of, you know, sometimes it's a condemning voice that condemns our own behaviour. You know, we do something and we hear this little voice come in that says, oh, don't be stupid, Bill, or whatever. This was that same type of sort of voice, but this time I was starting to have a dialogue. And what was bizarre, I got very confused at the beginning, because this voice only normally talks in sound bites. You know, we've all got this inner dialogue. I know it's very hard for people to sometimes accept, but it's not until you start thinking about it. We've all got it, and this inner dialogue is there. And sometimes it might come through as innovation or creativity. Sometimes it might come through as a condemning sort of, you know, voice that criticizes. But it is there, and what the bizarre thing that was for me, I started to have a conversation with this voice, because I would ask questions being right at the end of my life, wanting to know, you know, what's going to be happening, because I've always been curious. And this voice started to enter into dialogue with me, and it literally felt like days. And you know, I know people talk about squash time, but I literally had this conversation with my higher self, this inner dialogue, call it whatever you want. But I had this voice, and it just answered a lot of questions I'd always had since childhood. And this seemed to go on for days, but actually what it turned out, you know, was an hour or so. And I remember just getting right to the end of the conversation, and all this insight had come into me. And this image popped up in my head, and I was in a hallway, in my hallway at home, and I was a present, so I knew I was in the hallway, but I couldn't actually see my body. And I was sort of drifting towards the front door, and there was a knock on the front door. Somehow the door had opened, and it wasn't one of these light, you know, at the end of the tunnel things. But at the door was a policewoman and a policeman, and they had come to talk to my wife and said, "Sorry, Mrs. Murtha, we found your husband's body. It was up in a beach just on the next cove along from the village, and we need you to come down and identify it." And I can just remember that realization at that moment, thinking, I'm there, I'm experiencing this, and I now know that I've died. And now what I'm doing is observing in whatever present form I'm in, or energy, or whatever's happened to me now. I've died, and I'm observing this from some sort of weird place. And it's just every piece of my being, whatever form I was in at that time, just sort of looked at the whole situation and thought, I'm not ready to die. I'm absolutely not ready to die. And I got really emotional. I didn't know I had a body, so I don't know. You know, there was some sort of feeling element there. And I just remember thinking, I don't want to die. I'm not ready. I've got too much to do. And the moment I made that conscious decision that I wasn't ready to die, I wasn't ready to sort of go forward, all the imagery, you know, the policewoman, the policeman, my wife, the hallway of my home, just dissolved. I'm back in the water, but as opposed to that feeling that I'd left, which was that peace, calm, I couldn't feel the cold, all my organs, I'm back in the water, thrashing around in the dark, looking up to the sort of town again, and I'm thinking, I'm back in the water, and the pain had come straight back in, and I just remember looking, and suddenly I realised that there was a light in the near the shore, and there was a block of flats. I just, you know, being that I was somewhere in between an agnostic and sort of, you know, an atheist, I'd done something that must have just been instinctual. I actually started to pray, and I'd never probably prayed for most of my life, but it just seemed like it was the right thing to do. I didn't know what or who I was praying to, but I just remember looking at this building. There was a top floor flat, and the light was on. I could see a shadow. I didn't even know, it was so far away, I didn't even know if it was a man or a woman. And I just remember saying, please, if there's anyone out there, just please see me and see if you can save me. And I turned away again, and I'm really trying to concentrate to keep to keep floating in the water. The sun's pretty much gone now, and it's dark. And the full moon was sort of, you know, glittering across the sea. And I just remember turning away, and then in my mind, I thought it was in my mind, I heard a shout. And I looked over towards the shore, so I'm about, you know, by now about 100 meters up, which is, yeah, about 300 up from the coast. And I just thought in my mind, I heard this voice, and I turned around, and I saw this guy waving. And to begin with, I thought it was a bit of a mirage, because, you know, I thought, is my mind playing tricks on me? And this guy just kept shouting. And the reason I knew he was there, and it was real, because he said the most ridiculous thing, which was, you know, he shouted out, do you want help? And I just remember that it was the best thing that he could have said at the time, because it was like having an electric shock. I just thought, is this guy insane or something? Do I need help? After everything I've gone through, Of course I want help. And I can remember it was just that sort of, that energy spurt that I needed. And at that time, it was almost like I'd raised my level another 2 or 3 layers. I just remember thinking, you know, I'm going to survive it. And it was at that point, for the first time in probably 2 hours, I thought, I'm going to survive it. I am absolutely, I've gone through it all. I've gone through this amazing experience. I've gone through this conversation, this replay of experiences from my childhood and past. I am absolutely going to get out of this. I don't know how or why yet. Anyway, so I looked over to the shore, and where this guy had been waving at me, there was a crowd starting to build, and I could see torches going on, and people were shouting at me. It was all a bit, because I'm sort of in and out of consciousness, and I'm really trying to survive the cold. So I'm not really sort of fully aware or being able to focus on the shore. All I know is that they managed to fire, which I found out in retrospect now, they fired one of these orange buoys out to me. And I couldn't, it wasn't going anywhere near me. And somehow in the course of, I've probably lost the sense of time by now, but over so many minutes, whether it was 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you know, this buoy seemed to come closer and closer to me, miraculously, I don't know how. And I remember that this sort of orange buoy, a couple of feet long, coming really close to me, but by now my hands were full of hypothermia. I just couldn't, I couldn't grab it. And this is where the bizarre thing really happened. I was getting really frustrated. I just couldn't have any sensation in my hands. So I couldn't grab this sort of survival buoy. And there was a voice, and it came in the, you know, in the back of my head somewhere. And, you know, from nowhere, and this voice just said, look for the rope at the end. And I just grabbed the buoy again and looked, and there was about 1 meter of, like a noose at the end of it. And I just remember being shocked about this voice and where it come from. But I managed to sort of put my arm in the noose and sort of just really clamp my body, you know, my arms closely to my body. And what transpired for the next sort of 10 minutes or so is they managed to pull, well, there was a group of people apparently that managed to pull my body along the coast where the high wall was to a point where the inlet where the boats went in, and it was about 400 yards, something like that. That's where I busted all my ribs up. And I just remember them sort of dragging me out and just sort of slipping in and out of consciousness. And it was a bit like sort of the sheer relief of getting, and by now there's there's a few other people at the shore, and all I could see is torches and shouting and screaming. So I'm not really aware properly what's going on. All I do remember is they've got me on a stretcher, and I'm being whizzed up and down a zigzag sort of path back up to the road. And 1 minute I'm sort of conscious, the next minute not. And then I open my eyes again, I'm in an ambulance looking at the lights at the top of the ceiling. And all I can sort of remember in that journey, which apparently was about half an hour, was that I'm slipping in and out of consciousness, and all I can hear in the background every now and again, they were fighting to try and keep my body temperature up, and they did get me eventually to the hospital, and then they worked on me that night, and it was next morning I was just shocked and amazed at watching the sun come up in this sort of hospital bed in Torquay, where I'd all drips around me and everything, and you can't really process what you've gone through. I remember thinking, where am I? Where on earth am I going to start telling this conversation, or probably not tell it, because it's so extraordinary that I don't think I know how to frame this. So that was the amazing part of the water story, anyway.
Well, the thing is here, there are so many elements here of, as you and I have discussed many, many times in terms of my own writing, because I know an awful lot of people find my concept of the daemon somewhat difficult to accept. I have no idea why they find the concept of the daemon difficult to accept, the idea that we all have a form of higher self, a higher consciousness that shares our lives with us. And clearly, on 2 or 3 occasions here, and probably more times from, the conversations we've had, there was something inside of you that was greater than you, that was communicating with you, that seemingly had knowledge that you didn't have about your life. I mean, effectively, you know, the fact that it was aware of what you needed to grab when the boy was fired towards you, when your everyday self, what I would call your eidolon, was blissfully unaware of this. Now, there are quite a few other things that you mentioned there that really need to be focused in on. For instance, your description of the way in which when you started to die, you went into this altered state of consciousness. Now, the altered state of consciousness that you're describing there is something you're well aware of, I know, but maybe some of the people in the audience are not necessarily aware of. It's something called hypnagogia or hypnopompia. And it's this kind of liminal state when we're in particular periods of stress or when we're just lying semi-awake. Our mind seems to move into an area that is between this consciousness and this awareness and another form of awareness, that we broaden out our awareness. Now, when people do this, there was a guy called Dr. Buck, who may have around about 120 years ago, came up with the idea of what he called oceanic consciousness. And this is the idea that we start to realize that we're not a singular entity. The ego seems to be drawn away, and it is replaced by our accessing or our understanding of a greater consciousness that we are all part of. And that consciousness is embodied in everybody. Now, this is why it's so reinforced by your incident with the lady that hit you in the car. Because you seem to be swapping emotional experiences with a total stranger, and you were perceiving reality from the viewpoint of that stranger. Now, again, this is intriguing because it again suggests that at some subliminal level, we are able to understand the emotions of other people, as if there's a form of life energy that we're all part of. And it is only during these kind of near-death experiences that consciousness broadens out, the doors of perception are opened wider for us to appreciate, in literal terms, the wider understanding. Now, I remember you saying something in the book about the fact that when you were in the water, you started to realize the oneness of the cliffs you could see, and the trees, and the seagulls, and the birds, and everything else, and the realization of the oneness of the world around us. So it seems that it's only in these times of extreme stress or extreme somethingness that we start to really appreciate what we really are. Now, there were so many elements of your experience that are fulfilled, the elements of the moody traits or the Grayson traits of the near-death experience. Now, again, you were not to know that at the time, but, you know, the time slowing down, the panoramic life review, the meeting of the being of light, the entity that communicates with you, all of these elements are all classic elements of the NDE experience that have been reported since ancient Greek times. You know, this is not as if this is a new phenomenon. It is something that has been known for so long. And here's Bill in the water in 1999, a real cool dude, a hedonist, really living his life to the nth degree, suddenly has this most profound spiritual experience. Now, my associate, Dr. Penny Satori, very much writes about this idea of the way in which these experiences change us as human beings. We suddenly see the world in a very, very different way. We see the unity of humanity. We see the beauty of the world around us, and it helps us focus that. And I know that this is what happened to you. But before we move on, I'd just like to explain something as well, that this particular event was quite famous at the time, in that there was a British TV program, a network TV program, I think it was on the BBC, which was, I think Michael Burke did it, and yeah, it was featured, and it was featured on national television, wasn't it? You know, your experience.
Yeah, 15 million people, yeah.
How many watched it?
15 million people, yeah.
See, so here we have something, this is not Bill making this up. We know that these events actually happened because they became a huge event at the time. But the end of the story for this section is the bit I find really, really interesting. It is how Bill was saved. Now, this to me moves into areas of synchronicity. It moves into areas of fate. But it ties the story round in the most weird and strange way. So, Bill, if you can explain the telescope and how it all happened, because, guys, this will blow your mind.
it still sends a shudder down my, because I didn't really know at that time, you pitched it well, I wasn't in any one degree spiritually minded. I didn't read any, up until that point, and this sounds ridiculous, I had quite a hard upbringing, which later years I ended up discovering I had dyslexia and dyspraxia. But I didn't know it because we didn't have any terms for it when I was growing up. It's like these things have always been there, but we didn't have terms to gauge them, a metric against. So I had this sort of, problem with reading. So I'd never read a book from about 14 years old up till 33, 34. So for 20 years, I had not read a single book. That hadn't stopped me from getting to the top of my profession. But it just, reading for me, every time I picked up a book, I was straight back in that classroom as a 14-year-old, being, absolutely, slaughtered by an English teacher, because in them days you had to read out a paragraph of a passage perfectly, and then you could sit down, and of course I'd be there all day, to much annoyance of the class. So of course I had a paranoia about reading. And I just didn't want to read, so, anyway, I'd sort of, I'd got to, not know about any spiritual practice. I'd not read anything, I was just going along doing my life. So that is the context of where I was at the time. But anyway, I'm waking up in the hospital the next morning, and there was a guy there, and he had a drip, and he walked over to the window, and we both watched the sun come up. And it's funny, Anthony, you mentioned about the oneness feeling, with the cliffs. I didn't explain it, obviously, with the cliffs and the seagull, and this sort of feeling of oneness that I'd never experienced in my life up until that point of the accident in the water. But me and this guy, we looked out of this Torquay hospital, glass sort of, ceiling to floor, looked out the sun coming up over the hill, and we looked at each other, and there was a deep, deep connection of life force between us. We didn't need to say anything. Obviously, by the looks of him, he was probably in his 70s, he'd gone through a major operation or something, I'd gone through the experience the night before, but we looked at each other's eyes, and there was this knowing, there was this sort of wow, of life. And at that morning, I remember them sort of, the hospital was just gradually trying to get my temperature to sort of settle down and to sort of, gradually take more drips off of me. And I was sort of just trying to bring my body back into sort of centre, really. And then my wife came in the morning. But funny thing, in the afternoon, a really sort of hassled matron come in and sort of said, I'm really getting, a bit irritated. There's some reporters downstairs and they want to interview. And I told them they can't. And, I told them to go away. And I said, well, I don't mind honestly seeing them, and I wondered what the fuss was about, because, playing football, we were a couple of games away from playing at the greatest stadium in the country, which is the Wembley Stadium, and, we were only a couple of games away from playing in the final. And I thought the local paper, because we were in the paper most weeks for our soccer sort of, achievements, and, we were a couple of games away from the final. I thought they wanted to perhaps interview me for that and say, am I still going to be able to play, and all the rest of it. But no, I went to meet this reporter, and this guy sort of, clearly, in the first few seconds, I realised he wasn't interested in the sort of soccer conversation. And he said, I want to interview about the accident and about the way you survived. And I said, well, how do you know all this? Who's giving you all the information? And he said, well, right now, while I'm interviewing you, one of my colleagues is down on the seafront, and this is a national and local newspapers, so it got in quite a lot of local news. And he said, we're interviewing the guy that apparently spotted you. And I said, well, I don't know anything about this. Obviously, this is all new to me. And he said, oh, this is an amazing story. He said, the guy's called Nathan, and he lives in a flat that it sort of overlooks. And the way he described this flat, it's almost in the area of the building that I looked out at the top of the light where the guys, where there was a silhouette of a person, and when I was starting to pray in the water, and but I knew it was that sort of block of flats, because there's only one main block of flats there. And he said, yeah, this guy's been sort of talking to all different papers and local papers and, you know, about the extraordinary sort of events. I said, well, you better tell me more. Anyway, he went on to describe that the guy Nathan had a flatmate, and for the last 9 months, his flatmate had a beautiful new telescope, and they've been saying to Nathan that I'll lend it to you soon, I'll lend it to you soon. Anyway, Nathan almost got fed up with this because it was one of those promises that never seems to happen. And on the very afternoon of the evening I went in the water, this guy, for whatever reason, decides that he's going to go and lend Nathan a telescope because it was going to be a full moon that night. So Nathan had set up the telescope, you know, happily to sort of, you know, lived in a one-floor sort of flat, and he'd set the telescope up to look at the sort of full moon, gone away to the back of his flat where his kitchen was to make a drink, came back and realised that the telescope, for whatever reason, had dropped. Now, Nathan, what I found out about later from the media and from when I personally met Nathan a few days later, Nathan said I had the most bizarre feeling. He said, I should have just tilted the telescope back up towards the moon and carried on. But he said, I don't know why, I had this gut feeling to just look through the telescope. And he said, at the very point that I looked through, there was something thrashing around in the water. Now, bearing in mind it's dark by now and the moonlight sort of shimmering across the water. He said, first of all, I thought there was a couple of seagulls sort of fighting or something in the water. And he said, then I suddenly realised there was a guy with a head, or a person with a head. And he said, I just sort of looked at it in amazement and then called the 999 Coast Guard. Then I sort of realised this guy's struggling and we better go down. And, you know, there was other people down by the coastline. But Nathan said nothing like that has ever happened to him before that. And he said, you know, 9 months he'd been asking for that telescope. And, you know, we just sat, I just remember a few days after, just sat with Nathan and, funny enough, he'd actually found the bike that had been washed up a few days later and asked if he could have it. And I said, well, of course you can. It just saved my life. And, you know, I mean, I don't know if anyone's out there that's sort of had their lives saved by anyone, but money just doesn't seem appropriate. You just don't know what to say to that, apart from, you know, the immense amount of gratitude. But no amount of money just seems that it's appropriate. And, you know, I just remember sat there in tears talking to Nathan, and just as he was telling me this telescope, I'm just thinking, wow, this was my time to stay here. I mean, you know, there's just too many dominoes that line up for coincidence, really.
Wow, every time I hear that, it just takes my breath away. And because it is recorded, because it was covered by the press, there is nobody out there that can turn around and say that this is exaggerated in any shape or form. Now, this is what shakes my tree. This is the reason I do what I do. This is the reason I write the things I write about. I know that there are some people out there that criticize me for various reasons. But these experiences, Bill's experience here, these are genuine experiences that are happening with genuine people, where people are having the impossible happening. Now, it is really easy to turn around and say that the plural of anecdotes is not data. But that's beside the point. The point of the matter is that people have these experiences, and it is bad science, very bad science, to just dismiss these out of hand and pretend that they're what? Hallucinations? We don't even know what hallucinations are, but there you go, guys. We'll give it a nice little label to explain it. We call it a near-death experience. We turn around and say that the near-death experience is just part of the processes of the dying brain. So the dying brain will take Will back to the time he was a child and will then embody him in that body and then embody him in somebody else's body during an incident like that, and we know that there were other incidents that you actually had. But on top of this, it also showed you the alternate future. It showed you a future that could happen had you not been saved. Now, Is this an application of Everett's many worlds interpretation of quantum physics? Is this the idea that these realities do exist? It's just the wave function of that reality has not been collapsed. And you were in a position where you were out in what Philip K. Dick called orthogonal time. It's the time that you can look at where you see the alternate futures. Now we know that Herman Minkowski still talked about this. We know that people like various scientists have argued that the future is already out there, ready to come into existence, depending upon the choice of a conscious mind. This is not nonsense. It is far from it. This is the discoveries of quantum physics. So here we have this, and then we have this wonderful alternate story of how you were saved. Now, the chances of that happening are in the realms of the ridiculous. You know, it ties it together in the most amazing way. Now, Bill, we're getting towards the end now in terms of the interview and everything else. Can you tell people a little bit about what you're doing now? Tell them about the book, and tell them about, you know, the future work that you're planning to do. Because I know that you've changed your worldview, particularly now. You're working as a philanthropist. You're doing lots of other different types of work. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you're doing for a few more minutes, and then if you can tell if anybody wants to contact you, if anybody's interested in getting hold of the book, how they can do so.
Right, so there is absolutely no doubt that these transformative experiences have a major, profound effect on your life. You know, it's almost like suddenly, you know, you used to see the world like that, and then suddenly your lens on the world has just expanded. And for me personally, most people that have near-death experiences don't wake up the next day a changed person, because you've got a lot of processing to do. And that's what I ended up doing for 9 months, actually. Well, more than that, actually, over a year, you know, because you can't fathom or process so much of this stuff, particularly coming from a standing start like I did. So I had a really bad year after the accident, holding it in, not sharing it. How do you share something like that? Well, you know, and then it gets to a point where your consciousness is so full and your emotions are just so brimming that something bursts out. And for your own sanity, you know, you have to start sharing it. And I remember sharing it with my best friend at the time. Well, still is my best friend Simon at the time, and just starting to grow. And then so I couldn't, because me and my wife were going through, you know, not a particularly great time in our marriage. I didn't tend to sort of feel that she would trust me or want to listen to it, because we just weren't in a good place in our marriage at the time. But my best friend, we'd have conversations every day about it at length, because it was so extraordinary. And what it forced me to do is to sort of change my direction in my career. I came out of the construction and sort of development industry. I then tried to start my own company because I sort of believed that that would be a new start. But then I started to realise that no, that's not the reason I survived the water, you know. And I really started to get into a point of writing my story down. I found a writing tutor. You know, confidence was the biggest thing for me as a dyslexic to break through. For anyone, you know, that's got dyslexia, it's awful, because you might have this great story trapped inside of you and you haven't got a vehicle to deliver it. So, you know, I was fortunate, a good friend of mine, Katie Clark, that, you know, she taught me to write from the ground upwards, and it gave me a body of experience and a vehicle to get this work out there. And then Dying for a Change was the sort of launch pad. You know, I then decided to interview 500 leaders, which I call Visionaries, because I was really fascinated where the world was going, and I wanted to interview leaders from all types of sort of sectors, including science and medicine and business and arts and music. So I ended up spending sort of 4 or 5 years on a project called the Global Visionaries Project, of which Mr. Peake is part of, and it was just great, because it really started to open my mind up that there's people out there that are absolutely dedicated to creating a new way of living, a new way of business, a new way of, you know, a new form of capitalism, but where people actually are not treated like robots, that they can bring their best selves forward to do good work. And all around that time, you know, I started to become very interested that people are interested in change, particularly personal change, because first of all, we've got to do work on the personal change before we can change businesses or societies or economics. So it all comes down to personal change. So I trained up with with my wife, Jane, and we trained up with the Institute of Leadership Management, and we've become professional coaches, and we now go into businesses coaching people on transformation. And you know, I just love this work because so many people out there, including people of big, you know, some people I'm coaching are the sort of directors of multi-million-pound companies. And it's not until you start to work with them and realise what's going on, you know, to the outside world, their persona, their image, everything about them speaks and shouts success. It's not until you get the bonnet up on their personality and what really bugs them at the moment, you start to realise they might be in a really awkward place in a minute, and they're sort of a bit lost, and they're a bit sort of looking for meaning in their life and purpose. And I think so many people, you know, none of us know what battles are going on inside of everyone. And I just really believe that, you know, there's this change sort of happening out there, and we just enjoy this sort of transformational coaching because it's helping people to sort of form a new life, but also help them to bring, you know, their best selves forward. And yeah, if people want to contact me, we're now going into companies and sort of helping people at that first 3 months of, you know, which tends to be the hardest time, most challenging time of a new job, is when you first go in and you're feeling unsupported, you're trying to get a handle on a new career and a new culture. And I think, you know, this coaching is just going to get busier and busier, and it gives great rewards. You know, you get a really good sense of fulfillment helping people to create a new life for themselves. And yeah, if anyone wants to contact me, it's Bill at srsuk.com.
Excellent. And the book, if anybody wants to get hold of the book.
And the book is, there's a book on transformational media, which is called Dying for Change. And then there's another book, which is Visionaries, 100 Words, both American books. So yeah, it's, I'm working on the third book now.
Excellent. Bill, it's, as always, it's wonderful to talk to you, and I know we've had lots of long chats in the past as well, so all I can say is thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Murtha, one of the most incredible guys who's had the most incredible experience. Right, okay, folks, that's all for this month's edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness. Now, next month we've got a returning guest. We've got Jim Elvidge, the American writer who deals with the idea that this universe is a simulation. Jim has featured earlier on. Jim has a new book coming out, so we're very, very keen to chat with him about his new book. As always, thank you very much for Nunez, who is always there in the background making things happen in the right way, because without Radia I could not do this. I am absolutely sure that probably it is less hot in Denver than it is in here. I've just actually checked. The temperature in here at the moment is 36 degrees, which is utterly ridiculous for the UK in April, but that's one of those things. Okay, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be seeing you again soon. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. Thank you very much.